A couple of things I thought of as I was going over this at 2 o'clock in the morning and thinking about what we heard last night. I thought maybe I should change. I was given this title, and I thought about changing it to Restoring Fire in the Pine Barrens, but I figured I'd better not. But for those of you who weren't here last night, that was sort of the underlying point. There isn't enough fire for a lot of reasons, and the most important one to me, as having been a burn boss, doing one of my first prescribed burns down on Fire Island, actually in 1983, is that the longer you go between burns, the harder it is to get it done right and safely. But I didn't change it. And also, I know there's at least a couple of people I recognize here. I don't usually put the third up there, but there is a Bill Patterson IV, and he was very active in the Pine Barrens from 2001 to 2005, I think. Working with the Nature Conservancy, our son was in charge of the Nature Conservancy's Pine Barrens part of whatever they were doing here. So I'm not him. He's up in northern Maine now, happily managing 300,000 acres of timberland for the Nature Conservancy, as far north in Maine as you can get. And he's doing no fire because that's the asbestos forest up there. But at least two of our grandsons were born here in Brookhaven or the thereabouts. And so we do have ties to the area. Okay, now I'm going to have Neil do next because he knows when I'm getting behind, and even if I don't say next, he changes the slide. So we may be done in about 5 minutes. So next. Okay, so I was not here for the sunrise. I always deny that I was out of the country here whenever we have a big fire. But one of the things I've learned since I came back to New England, I grew up in the Boston area, went to school in Maine, but then went to Minnesota for graduate studies, and I came back to UMass in 1978. And I've worked in Bar Harbor and in Miles Standish and a bit down here and other places. There's always one defining moment, and it's a big fire, if you're a fire ecologist or interested in managing fuels. And certainly the Sunrise Fire was one of those, and I've shown this picture, which I think I got from the Nature Conservancy, many places. Now that urban-rural interface has become the issue rather than just putting out all fires, which is what I learned in the 1960s in forestry school. Next. So I'm going to do a little bit on the history very briefly. We've actually done a lot of historical work on the vegetation and fire interactions on Long Island, but it was all back in the 80s. I'm going to tell a little bit about my own history, learning to prescribe burn, be a burn boss sort of on my own because I wanted to conduct fires in order to learn about the effects of fires on fuels on the one hand and reducing fire hazard, and on ecology and other aspects on the other. The best way to do that is to light fires, and I have never been on a wildfire, which is good because I've lit hundreds of prescribed fires. But also, when you're lighting fires, to find out what's going on, you need somebody to put them out. And so I've trained over 1,500 students and actually had 25 people that I, quote, red carded this spring. I still teach a 130, 190 course at UMass on a volunteer basis. But the history here, we use pollen and charcoal to reconstruct vegetation and fire. There's a piece of charcoal. And the next slide. Next. Okay. I actually had to go to an old thesis of one of my former students and copy this out, and it's not a great slide. It's not really obvious, but don't concentrate on what it says, just on what I say and point out. There's only 2 or 3 things here that are really important. This is from Deep Pond, which is, the way I look at it, upstream, upwind from here, what, 5 miles or so? It's not very far. And you'd say, well, that's not the Pine Barrens, that's up in the moraine and it's oak pine woodland. But the way I think of it, that's where fires probably started even before Europeans arrived. And mostly in the Northeast, fires burn from west to east or southwest, northeast, or something like that. So a fair number of fires that started up in the moraines probably made it down to the Barrens. So what's important here? This was at Camp Wawapex, and we got a core actually that went way down to the base of it. But this is 2,000 years. You probably can't see it. So we've got a couple of millennia of record. This we know is the time that Europeans came to the landscape. We know that because the agricultural indicator ambrosia increases there. And it's important to note that there's a lot of charcoal up here. This is a whole lot of charcoal. The Bar Harbor fire was down around here in the amount of charcoal it put into ponds on Mount Desert Island. So we have huge amounts of charcoal up here, but we have huge amount of charcoal sometime down here. So fire clearly has been on the landscape. From all the work I've done in New England, the number of lightning-caused fires is minuscule. There are some. But we have to assume that Native Americans were starting most of these fires. Well, I have to. You have your choice, but that's what I think. So the important thing here is that there was at least as much at some times fire before Europeans arrived than after. And importantly, until the time that Europeans arrived, there was actually more oak than pitch pine. This is white pine over here, and of course we know there's not much white pine out on the island. And then there's a sharp drop in oak, and it corresponds with some fires and an increase in pitch pine. A lot of this is due to cordwood cutting. I mean, they actually ran out of cordwood and they were importing it from Maine and things like that on the coastal islands of southern New England and New York. And then we've got a recovery in oak, and the amount of pitch pine continues. Again, this is on the moraine and probably accurately reflects there. If we had a core from the Pine Barrens on the south side of the island, it would undoubtedly show more pitch pine than oak, but there's no place to get a core, except on Fire Island where we have them, and that's kind of a ways away from the Barrens. Next. So, jumping from ancient history to sort of ancient history, my history, the first summer burn in the modern era, which is when I started, and people who started before me were modern, but among the first burns that were done during the growing season, this was one on Fire Island, and we did that, a little 10th acre plot. It had rained an inch the week before, and we were burning huckleberry to see how well it burned, and it burned like crazy. And that actually led to research I'll just touch on briefly at the end, but we've been studying the effects of summer burns ever since. Not that they have application on a large scale, because smoke is a major issue, as people noted last night, but we also picked this little patch because there was no poison ivy in it. Next. At the same time, at Ram Pasture on Nantucket, which is, 40 miles off to the northeast or something probably, we had just started an experiment with Mass Audubon where we were looking at 4 plots. One we burned in the spring, and that's the first burn, and that's the fire chief. He's one of a handful of people that really allowed us to get going with what I would call ecological burning. He was basically a pyromaniac, and he loved it. Chief Watt, I think, just retired a few years ago. He was there a long time. This is a spring burn that we had done probably in April of '83. Then we did one in August of '83 on an adjacent plot, so that was after the Fire Island one. And then we had a plot that we mowed and a plot that we didn't mow. I was working with Bob Zarimba at the time, who I know did quite a bit of work on Long Island back in the '80s after he left Nantucket. What we found was that the only way to maintain grassland was with growing season, burning, or mowing. And I learned this elsewhere in trying to restore old fields with spring burning. Spring burning is the best way to convert grassland to something else that's woody. So this was an important result. We kept this burning going every 2 years until 1997. It took us about not 8 burns, about 5 burns, or 10 years, to get the data that allowed us to come to that conclusion. And it's published, so we're pretty confident of the results of that, and we've seen it over and over again. So, but I just wanted to point out, the summer burn at Ram Pasture was 2 months after the slide I just showed. So, go ahead. We used that information in the early 90s. The Park Service wanted us to burn at Floyd Bennett Field. And that was an adventure. People talked about hook and ladders. We had hook and ladders from the New York City Fire Department up over our burn unit. I think we burned a unit in the spring and we burned a unit in the summer, about 15 acres or so each between the runways. And again, we saw a better response in summer than we did with the spring burns. So there was an application within 10 years of the research. We started sort of from scratch in the early 80s. Next. Now I'm going to jump into sort of what we've learned from the 95 fires on. And really, the person that should be up here talking to you is Marilyn Jordan, because she was here, she studied all of it. We published a paper together with Andy Windisch from New Jersey, but I don't think it ever would have happened without the knowledge that Marilyn had. And I threw this in among much that I could have put up here, but I don't have time to go over it. Just because, as we all know, most of the fires, wildfires, burn in the spring. But there's some percentage of them, including the Sunrise Fire. That's what really impressed me about the Sunrise Fire, that it was in August. There, in the modern era of the last 50 or 70 years, there have not been very many big fires anywhere from New Jersey to Maine in Pine Barrens in the summer. But that Sunrise Fire occurred here, and there have always been a few fires, and then surprisingly, almost none in the fall. September, almost none, because if there's a hurricane season, that's when it hits. And usually the Bar Harbor Fire was out here in the middle of October, and that's because they just didn't have any hurricanes. The drought index was way over 600. It was the driest month in 170 years of recorded history in Maine. So it takes that kind of drought to get fires out here. Next. Don't try and figure out what that is. My point here is that if you want data to support what you think you'd like to do, go to Marilyn Jordan, Patterson Windisch, and other things that Marilyn's published, and other work that has been done since I haven't worked here in the last 15 or so years, that there's a large database. There's always more to know. That if I get cut off at the end, and because I've talked too long, my take-home punch, one of them is, don't let a lack of knowledge stop you from trying something. I wouldn't try burning 10,000 acres if you don't know how to put it out, but you can burn, as we've found, 1/10 of an acre. And in New England, that was enough to teach us a lot. Bring in people from the West, and they say, oh, that's ridiculous. What can you learn from that? If you don't know anything, just putting fire in the woods is an education. So I'm not going to say what that says. You can read the paper. And I cleared this with Neil. We have data like this from the Sunrise Fire, or actually in Long Island, the Sunrise Fire area. What we did is we took old air photos. In the case of Albany, we went back to 1928, but I'm going to show the 1940 versus 1990 comparison. This was a thesis done by Andy, one of my graduate students who's now with the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts. And we had a very good air photo interpreter who could take old photos and new photos and match them up and interpret them at the same level of detail. And we can take individual pixels like right here and see what it becomes in 1990 and produce a transition matrix. And from that, and we get a huge big table that I took out here of numbers, which would mean nothing. So I took that slide out. Next is just a summary of what we can do. We can see that for Albany, from 1940 to 1999, the two primary plant communities of interest dropped from only 100 acres to practically nothing. This is the critical habitat for a lot of the LEPs. And scrub oak, which is also critical, dropped by to 1/10 of what it had been. Not surprisingly, what increased was a tenfold increase in developed areas, tenfold increase or more in hardwoods, neither of which are rare on the landscape. And in the case of developed, that's the one thing you can do that's really bad in terms of the habitat. People have to live there, so you can't say its development is bad, but we need to have it in the right places. We actually have this kind of information, as I said, for the Sunrise Fire area and for, I think, 4 other Barrens areas, Maine, New Hampshire, 2 in Massachusetts, and 3 in Massachusetts. So this is very informative, and this is kind of a long-term monitoring where you don't have to go out in the field at all. You just have to go into the archives, find air photos, and then get a good photo interpreter who can say, okay, this 1928 photo isn't as good as the 1991, and not interpret too much from the 1991 that you can't see in 1928. We had one person who did all of this at UMass. She was great, and we're pretty confident of the results she came up with. Next. And that allows you, again, don't look at the details, but that allows you to build these computer models that say, this is what's going to go to this under these circumstances. So we have ways of taking that data, those data, and modeling them and producing some way to think about the future. I don't like to predict the future because it's a very risky business, but we have ways of guiding us to know at least whether we're getting what we think we're getting or we're learning something new and we're not getting it. So next. Okay, now I'm going to jump out of Long Island a little bit and talk about a little bit of what we've learned in other Barrens areas that are pretty similar to some areas on Long Island and that I think have a applicability here, even in the issues that we're facing today. I grew up just south of Boston. I remember going through this area to a Boy Scout camp right after the 57 fire burned 15,000 acres in 10 hours, 18 acres a minute. It stopped at Cape Cod Bay. They lost 4 people, firefighters. We did an estimate of if the same area burned in 1990 as burned in 1957, compared it with the amount of development that this actually the same photo interpreter that I was just talking about, Janice Stone, she looked and saw how much development had occurred in that area since that time. We went to a real estate agent and a local forester and got an idea of what the value of real estate was. We estimated if this area burned, the 15,000 acres burned again in 1990, the cost would have been $500 million in property loss, to say nothing of the potential loss of life and injuries and so forth. What happened was after the 57 fire burned, it came back to dog hair stands of pitch pine. Then the looper got in there in the late 70s, just before I started at UMass. This is what it looked like in 1989 when I tried the first burn in this kind of situation. When you're young and foolish, you do things that you realize later on were young and foolish. But fortunately, I had people, especially the local fire chiefs and fire wardens, who guided us in the right direction. We estimated that there were 30 to 48 tons per acre of fuel, and not all of that was big stems. We had probably 15 or 20 tons of all of this brush and huckleberry and stuff. This is a dormant season shot. But next slide. This is one of my other punchlines. We could have done nothing in Massachusetts without the cooperation of people, and that's hard to get. And people who come from the West, they just don't understand it. Because you have big agencies, they have their own crews, they often don't even talk to each other unless there's a big wildfire. But if you're trying to accomplish ecological burning, we'll do it ourselves. I figure there were somewhere between 6 or 7 agencies represented in this 15-person crew. We had 3 brush breakers. Jack Faustino is the one who made sure I didn't get us all in trouble. Tim Simmons was there, not knowing what trouble I could get him into, probably. I always wondered about the woman in the trench coat. She actually was the regional forest supervisor. And she was out there. She didn't stay for the burn. And we had the Plymouth fire chief who was looking over our shoulder like a hawk. I mean, this is his shoulder, but he was looking over us. And they set very strict guidelines. This was a 1 acre burn. They wanted 3 brush breakers and 6,000 gallons of water in addition to what was in the brush breaker. And I thought that was a little bit of overkill, but what did I know? I'd never done this before. I'd seen the results when I was 11 years old. Next. So that's what it looked like about halfway through. And I remember going to Jack, who actually just passed away a few months ago. And I said, and we had our interaction period when I was trying to convince him and the Plymouth chief and the Carver chief that we wanted to try this out. It was about at this point, we had light winds, they were kind of shifting. Somebody said last night, those are the worst winds. They are. We burned other areas like this, and we would have been much happier with a 15 to 20 mile an hour wind with the ocean as a fire break. I mean, we burned all of No Man's Land Island at once with helicopters, but, you know, we had nothing but water for a mile around. At about this point, I went to Jack and I said, you know, what about those brush breakers? Do you think we got them? I think we're okay. I said, okay, Jack, fine. And we were okay. But, you know, when you got 34 tons per acre of fuel going up, and I didn't put an after fire, but it was just down to nothing but black. And we scorched all the trees because it was spring. They all put out new needles. But there was a few tense moments, especially later on when I discovered that the grad student who was taking the RH readings was a little off. And I won't get into that. But we made it. At the same time, at Camp Edwards, we were burning 450, 500, 800 acres using helicopters. But we had 150-foot fire breaks that were bulldozed to sand. You can do that in an artillery range. You can't do this out in a state forest. Next. And the area of Miles Standish probably is not a perfect analog here. There, actually, white pine was more important before settlement, and oak, and we actually had some beech and other things, and it was only after we saw a tremendous increase in charcoal after the settlement that we saw pitch pine becoming important. So the point here is these are diverse communities. They go back and forth. In the case of this, it was the northern pine looper that was causing defoliations. Every 20 to 30 years, it's a native species, and it's at the southern end of its range. But I've thrown in some things, I think, next. These are just the quotes, and you can try and read these, but I'll read them out loud. I just pulled them out of literature that I had. I knew from the time I was an undergraduate that pitch pine was attacked by the northern pine looper. I learned that from the Silvics handbook that I was forced to memorize as a forestry student. 50,000 acres were defoliated by pine looper in southern Massachusetts in 1954, 3 years before the 57 fire, which burned 15,000 acres on May 8th and 9th. Regeneration of that fire was defoliated and killed by mid-1970s outbreak, and that's where we were burning. We were burning inside the area that burned in 57. Eastern pine looper and pine needle miner. The damage done by these caterpillars and pitch pine was the most important forest health issue in New Jersey in 1977. Trees on over 400,000 acres in pine lands were defoliated. On Long Island, this is from Jordan, Patterson, and Windish. The central Pine Barrens region is a complex mosaic of pitch pine, yada, yada, yada. Pitch pine have been killed by periodic outbreaks of the pine looper. So we're going to be talking about southern pine beetle today. If you solve that, probably we'll get loopers coming in to present another challenge that we'll be happy to address. Next. Just about done. There, as I said in the beginning, we know a whole lot more than we did in 1980 when I first came here. And there were people, especially in the fire suppression, as we talked about last night, community, who knew a lot more then than they know now. What I've seen in Massachusetts is, as we were saying last night, they have all these brush breakers and they don't have people who know how to drive them. And if they do, they are justifiably scared to death of them. Because if that 57 fire had done a 90-degree turn, as it could have if we'd gotten a wind shift, there would have been hundreds of people killed because they were just fighting on the lines. and the whole southeast line would have been taken out all the way to the canal at least. So we're not playing with fire here, we're playing with disaster. We've got a lot of information. The main source now, and it's great, is the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange that came along just as I was retiring, sort of. And before that, we had a little website at UMass based on a joint fire science program that's still active. We don't maintain it, but there's a lot of information, including some of the experiments we've done, which is maybe the last slide or so. Starting in 1985, based on what we learned at Fire Island and on Ram Pasture, we started an experiment, which we're continuing to this day, of burning 10th-acre plots, pretty small, but again, the Park Service wanted us to do 2 meter by 2 meter. We got them up to 20 meters by 20 meters. And we could learn some things. A fire starts, and about the time it gets to 10th acre, then you start running into problems, and we could see that. In pine oak with huckleberry underneath it, we would have 8 to 10 foot flame lengths, even in the summer, on the first burns that we did, which was in an area that hadn't burned since the 1930s. So that's 55 years. So we've either burned in the dormant season or the growing season. We threw in mowing just because the Park Service said, we will never burn. Why would we have you do this on our land? They now have one of my students, Dave Crary, former students, has an approved fire management plan to burn 600 acres, wishful thinking, 600 acres a year. And we had controls. And the one thing that we have over tall timbers, which has much longer routine on larger plots, we documented very carefully, especially the fuel load in the plant community, especially the shrub community response to these, and that is ongoing. So my point is that's summarized on that website that I just showed you. You can get at it either directly by Northern Barrens Fuels or through the NAFC website. And do I have anything else? Yes, I think I do. Finally, initially I and everyone else was worried about fires escaping. By the end of my time, I was worried about smoke escaping. That's 120-acre grassland on Noshawn that we burned in an hour on a Sunday afternoon in April. We blocked out the sun on Martha's Vineyard for the whole afternoon. But we were able to do it with strong winds that drove the fire right into the sound and last. So that just shows, this I think was about a 450-acre burn that we did in probably 1990. That's what it says. We picked it up on satellite because there happened to be a satellite run go by about a few weeks later. This was all the smoke. We were using ping pong balls. This line here is that line there, and all that smoke went up into Sandwich, and we don't do that anymore. 20 acres, 30 acres maybe. That's on a scale. Part of it is equipment. They switched over from Hueys to Blackhawks, and the ping pong machine didn't fit and that sort of thing. But anyway, that is the end. So, and I'm a little bit over.